tipping point, the beginning of the end. In any massive event like this, with being on this side of history, there is always a tipping point. Of course, when you're going through it, it may seem that getting to this point is taking forever. However, we know that there was an actual tide turning from this massive war. Join us now for more Liber-Tea as we dive further deeper into this series. Like, subscribe, comment, and join the discussion as we continue on this perilous path of death and destruction, with the glimmering hopes of victory on the horizon too. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 7, 1941, the U.S. changed its status in the war from neutral, bound by the Neutrality Acts, a series of acts passed in the 1930s from entering into war, to decisively active on the Allies' forces' side, repealing these acts. After the attack, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session in Congress calling December 7th a date that will live in infamy, and within an hour following the speech, Congress declared war on Japan. Up until then, American public opinion was very much divided, and it seemed in one overnight almost all of America united to enter the war. Another famous movement that turned the tide was the Battle of Stalingrad, or could be better said, the Battle for Stalingrad, which happened around July and August 1942 through February 1943. Why is this significant? This brutal battle is considered by many Russians as one of the most historic and patriotic combats of this entire war. It is most famous for stopping the Germans' advancement into Europe and made an about-face in favor of the Allies. About 30 miles, 50 kilometers along the Volga River, had Germany won this important city, they would have cut Russian transport with the south of Russia and become a critical gateway for the northern flank of the larger German army. Also, not to be outdone by pettiness, Hitler would have all-out bragging rights for taking the city named after the great Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, which we know from report after report. Hitler was all about bragging rights. Can you imagine the social media blitz if this would have happened in these modern times? Luckily, we are spared such a historical onslaught of comments and harassments, including the slew of alternative facts. The ultimate objective of the ever-cunning Hitler was to completely erase Soviet forces in the south, harvest the area resources, and then gain ground by military force, either heading north to Moscow or steering south to the remaining of the opposition's Caucasus. We won't ever really know or understand why, but at the last minute, Hitler changed his original plan and decided to use his military capital in a different way. In what seemed a very greedy and impatient move, or possibly overconfident, he commanded his army to do both, take Stalingrad and the Caucasus at once. This calculation cost Hitler and his minions a great deal and would eventually make them succumb to the greatest cost of all, losing the war. But we'll get to that shortly. As we have said over and over in war, and this one in particular, strategy is key. Here, Hitler's greed cost him strategy. We know from military experts that allocation of resources is the crux of any winning battle plan. It is said there must be about a 3-to-1 advantage for victory to be successful. And another strategic mismove is the Germans failed to push the Soviet forces to the flank, which gave the opposing forces momentum and the advantage of the offensive. With Soviet forces now on the counteroffensive, and Hitler's over-obsessive idea with capturing Stalingrad at any and all costs, the German army was headed for a massive defeat and a stunning loss. Following all of this, in June 1944, the Allied forces' invasion of Western Europe was put into motion. Better known as the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord, or D-Day, was the simultaneous landing of U.S., British, and Canadian forces on 5 separate beaches, liberating all of northern France. Utah Beach was the most western of the beaches, about 3 miles long, with the 6-mile-long Omaha Beach, where the 1st Infantry took the most brutal assault of all of the D-Day activities. Americans there lost about 2,400 soldiers. Gold Beach was about 5 miles long, and the British forces were able to push the Germans back about 6 miles inland. The 4th of the 5 beaches was Juno Beach, suffering about 1,200 injuries between mixed British and Canadian forces. And finally, the 5th beach was Sword Beach, and was a major hub and route for northern France. These beaches were important because not only were they easier to access for defending in terms of air cover and transport, but also because they were all less heavily defended with Hitler's over-budgeted resources serving elsewhere. This laid the ground for victory that was to come. But of course, all of this does not come without a cost. From the German side, there's reported about 4,000 to 9,000 deaths and up to 10,000 casualties from the combined Allied forces. With this strength and drive well underway, the next biggest turning point was emancipating Paris, and emancipation the Allied forces did. After the crushing defeat of Normandy, Paris was not the first target on their minds, however. There was a German unrest of the people against Germany at this time, and it was made necessary for this region to shoot to the top of the list. Almost in an unprecedented move, German military forces abandoned much of their posts in the middle of the night and surrendered or fled, about 20,000 in total. On August 25th, the French resistant forces and American soldiers were victoriously welcomed by the Parisians, and the then President Charles de Gaulle led the triumphant parade down the most famous main street in Paris, the Champs-Élysées. France is now free and has unified and regained its sovereignty after 4 wretched years. The final and last attempt at keeping what Hitler and his forces had so strategically fought for was the Battle of the Bulge. About 250,000 Axis troops were sent across an 85-mile stretch of the Allied front starting at southern Belgium into Luxembourg, crossing through a vast region of dense forests and mountains. In total, there were over 1 million soldiers involved in this turning point from both sides of the war. Although many have thought that the Allied forces were taken by surprise, the whole truth is that although they couldn't anticipate the massive scale in which Hitler would try to attack, a high-ranking official in the U.S. Army was diligently keeping track of the German tank divisions in the winter of 1944. During this time, General Cook noticed that there were 5 tank divisions accounted for, but there should have been a total of 15. So he asked the logical question, where were the other 10? Years later, Cook wrote, "The Allied failure leading to the strategy of Bulge was an evaluation and application of the intelligence information at hand." It is good that Bulge ended up as such a positive turning point for the Allied war efforts, or Cook's quote may have sealed the fate of many more lives. It is often an unheard of hardship, however. The weather played a large part in the adversity of the battle. Because of this, Hitler, not missing a chance, decided to time his offensive strategically in mid-December, so there would be more chance of sub-zero temperatures, freezing rain, and dense fogs in keeping with the terrain. Included in this misery and danger to the Allied forces, airstrikes would be the most difficult in these situations. The U.S. suffered about 64,000 cold-related injuries from the frozen landscape, pneumonia, and trench foot, which comes from feet being submerged in sub-cold wet conditions and results in the feet becoming immensely painful if left untreated. Through all of this, the Soviets launched a dominating attack on the Axis forces' eastern front. Over 2 million Russian army personnel moved westward, capturing cities such as Warsaw and Krakow. On January 27, 1945, one of the most famous concentration and extermination camps, Auschwitz, was liberated. Between 1940 and 1945, about 1.1 million Jews were murdered through some of the most horrific conditions there. Although most of Russia's army had seen and experienced some of the most hardening conditions that war had to offer, nothing prepared them for the appalling scenes that they were to find at Auschwitz. About 7,000 survivors from over 1 million inmates were still left, at the hatred of these years from the Nazi Party was clearly evident to these shocked Russian soldiers. In our next episode, we'll start wrapping up the loose ends of World War II. Stick with us here, folks. There's still much to learn, even though we're toward the end. Join us for the next Liber-Tea, where we close out this series, but not without some more interesting and amazing facts about this global war. Like, comment, and subscribe to join in the conversation.